Dad laughed when I said I bought my first house. It's probably a tiny, ugly dump, he mocked. I just smiled and showed him the address. His jaw dropped. I knew exactly how this was going to go. My entire life, my father had one hobby: mocking me. If I succeeded at something, he'd belittle it. If I failed, he'd make sure I knew he'd seen it coming. Nothing I ever did was enough. So when I announced that I had finally bought my first house, I didn't expect congratulations. I didn't expect pride. I didn't expect anything except the usual sneer, the usual dismissal. And sure enough, he leaned back in his chair, chuckling. "What is it, some tiny, ugly dump?" he said, shaking his head. "Let me guess, some rundown shack in the middle of nowhere?" I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. "What's this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "An invitation," I said. "Housewarming party. Next Saturday." He scoffed, tossing the envelope aside like it was junk mail. Yeah, I'll be there," he muttered. "Might as well see what kind of mess you got yourself into this time." I just smiled. Because this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't the one who would be embarrassed. This time, it was his turn to be speechless. The week leading up to the party felt surreal. I had spent my whole life trying to prove myself to a man who never believed in me, but this time, I wasn't seeking approval. I was delivering a lesson. A final, satisfying lesson. The housewarming wasn't just some casual gathering. It was going to be an event. My new home wasn't just a house. It was the house. A sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. The kind of place my father had always dreamed of living in, but never could. And I had done it without him. I sent out the invitations to family, old friends, and some key people from work. I made sure everything was perfect: caterers, music, even valet parking. If he thought I had bought some rundown shack, he was in for the shock of his life. But then, something interesting happened. The calls started. First, it was my mother. She had never been outright cruel like my father, but she was complicit, always standing by, letting him tear me down. "Hey, sweetie," she said in that overly sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "Your dad said you bought a house. That's so nice. Where is it?" I could hear the skepticism in her voice. She wasn't asking out of excitement, she was fishing for something to criticize. "I sent an invitation," I said simply. "You'll see." A pause. Then a hesitant laugh. "You know your dad is just teasing, right? He only wants what's best for you." "Right. Because ridiculing your son's every accomplishment is the hallmark of good parenting." "I guess we'll find out next Saturday," I said, then ended the call before she could keep going. Then, 2 days before the party, my father called. That was rare. He never called unless he had something insulting to say. "What's the deal with this address?" he asked. "This isn't some mistake, is it?" "No mistake," I said. "That's my house." Silence. Then he let out a short, scoffing laugh. "Yeah, okay. You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," I said, smiling to myself. "Just show up." I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, the uncertainty. He had spent his whole life believing I was beneath him. The idea that I could have done something this big, something he never could, was scrambling his mind. Good. This was just the beginning. The day of the party arrived, and everything was set. The driveway of my mansion, yes, an actual mansion, was lined with luxury cars. The kind of cars my father used to point out in magazines, saying, "That's real success. Not whatever nonsense you're doing." Valets in crisp uniforms took guests' keys as they arrived. Inside, caterers moved smoothly through the grand entryway, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. The chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the room, and soft jazz played in the background. Every detail screamed wealth, power, success. And then, he arrived. I saw my father step out of his aging sedan, looking around in confusion. My mother was right behind him, clutching her purse like she had accidentally wandered into the wrong neighborhood. He stared up at the house, his jaw tightening. This was not what he expected. Not even close. I walked out onto the front steps, taking my time. I wanted to see it, the exact moment he realized just how wrong he had been about me. "Dad," I said, my voice cool and casual. "Welcome to my home." He blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, my father was speechless. I led them inside, where guests were already mingling, some of them people he used to admire from afar. A well-known businessman shook my hand, an investment mogul I had worked with patted me on the back. My father knew these faces. He had talked about these people. But now, I was the one among them. "Come on in," I said smoothly. "Make yourselves comfortable." He followed stiffly, his eyes darting around, taking in everything, the high ceilings, the modern art, the sweeping staircase that led to the second floor. My mother was silent, gripping his arm like she needed something to hold on to. And then, as if on cue, one of my staff members approached. "Sir," the man said respectfully, "would you like me to take your coat?" My father turned, completely stunned. "Staff." I had staff. He hesitated, then mutely handed over his coat, his hands slightly unsteady. He still hadn't spoken a word. I had dreamed of this moment. Lived for it. The years of humiliation, the mockery, the dismissive smirks, it had all led to this. And I wasn't done yet. "Let's have a drink," I said, leading them into the lounge. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and gestured for him to sit. He lowered himself into the plush leather chair, still looking dazed. I took the seat across from him, swirling my drink slowly before taking a sip. Then I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You always told me I'd be nothing," I said quietly. "You laughed at me. Humiliated me. Made me feel worthless." His face twitched. His fingers clenched against the armrests. "But look around, Dad." I gestured at the house, the guests, the success dripping from every corner of the room. "I built this. Without you. In spite of you." He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. But he still didn't speak. Because for the first time in my life, he had nothing to say. And I wasn't finished. I let the silence stretch between us, savoring it. For years he had filled every quiet moment with criticism, every achievement with backhanded remarks. But now, he was just sitting there, gripping the chair like he needed to hold on to something solid. I took another slow sip of my whiskey. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked, tilting my head. "Not what you were expecting." He swallowed hard. "This," he cleared his throat. "This isn't yours." I smirked. "Oh? You." He shook his head. "You didn't do this on your own." There it was. The last, desperate grasp at control. The idea that I, the son he spent his life mocking, could have achieved all this without him was too much for him to process. I leaned back, letting my glass rest on the table. "Tell yourself whatever you want, but the reality is right in front of you." I gestured around the room. "I built this life. You had nothing to do with it." His face darkened, but before he could say anything, my mother finally spoke. She glanced around, her voice small. "We didn't know you were doing so well." I raised an eyebrow. "No, you didn't. Because you never cared to ask." She flinched. My father just clenched his jaw, his pride fighting against the obvious truth in front of him. And then I went for the final blow. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough to make it personal. "I invited you here for one reason," I said, my tone like steel. "So you could see what you'll never be a part of." My father's eyes widened. "This is my life now," I continued. "And you?" I smiled coldly. "You're nothing to me." His hands curled into fists, his face turning red. "You ungrateful little—" I lifted a hand, cutting him off. "Aha," I said calmly. Then I turned slightly and made a small motion with my fingers. Security stepped forward. Two large men in suits approached smoothly, standing just behind him. My father blinked, his mouth opening slightly in shock. "You're done here," I said. "Escort him out." And make sure he never sets foot on my property again. My mother gasped. Wait. No, I said firmly. I spent years putting up with his garbage. Years of being laughed at. Disrespected. Made to feel like nothing. I stared directly at my father. Not anymore. The guard stepped forward. He looked between them and me, breathing heavily. His face was a mix of rage, humiliation, and something else. Something that almost looked like defeat. But he didn't fight it. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and gave me one last look. Then he turned and walked out. I exhaled, letting the weight of the moment settle. For the first time ever, I had the power. And my father? He was nothing more than a bad memory, one that would never haunt me again. As the doors shut behind them, a quiet ripple went through the room. A few guests glanced over, curious but polite enough not to ask. The music played on, the clinking of glasses continued, and just like that, he was gone. I exhaled slowly, feeling something in my chest unravel. For years I had carried his words, his mockery, his doubts. But now, he was out of my house, out of my life. And for the first time ever, I felt free. I turned back to my guests, plastering on an easy smile. Well, I said, raising my glass. Now that the entertainment is over, let's enjoy the night. A few chuckles, a clink of drinks, and just like that, the celebration continued. But deep down, I knew, this night wasn't just about the party. It was about winning. And I had won. As the night went on, I found myself stepping away from the party, out onto the grand balcony overlooking the city skyline. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the distant hum of life below. Inside, my guests laughed and talked, the warmth of success wrapping around them like a comfortable embrace. But I needed a moment. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the lights. It still didn't feel real. Not just the house, the wealth, or the event, but the silence. For the first time in my life, my father's voice wasn't in my head, whispering doubts, tearing me down. He was gone. For good. I should have felt relief. Victory. And in a way, I did. But there was something else, too, something heavier. Because beneath all the satisfaction, there was a part of me that had once wanted him to be proud. It wasn't just about proving him wrong. A long time ago, before I truly understood who he was, I had wanted him to see my worth. To recognize that I had worked, that I had fought, that I had built something incredible. But tonight made it clear, he never would. And that was his loss. I took a deep breath, letting the thought settle, and then I let it go. I had spent too much of my life chasing validation from someone who never deserved that power over me. Now I was done. I straightened, adjusting my jacket, and took one last look at the city. Then I turned, stepping back inside, where laughter and success awaited me. I had won. And it was time to enjoy it. As I stepped back inside, the atmosphere of the party wrapped around me like a warm embrace. Conversations flowed easily, glasses clinked together in celebration, and people who once doubted me now shook my hand with admiration. This wasn't just a housewarming party, it was a statement. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with colleagues, old friends, and even distant relatives who had barely acknowledged me before tonight. Funny how success had a way of making people pay attention. But there was one person I was looking for. In the far corner of the room, near the grand fireplace, I spotted him, Mr. Langford. A man whose influence in my industry was legendary. He had been one of my father's idols. The kind of man my dad would kill to have a conversation with. And now? He was here, at my housewarming party. I approached, and as soon as he saw me, his face lit up. "There's the man of the hour," he said, extending his hand. "This place is incredible." I shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Langford. It means a lot coming from you." He chuckled. "Call me Richard. And listen, I've been hearing a lot about what you're doing with your business. I like it. A lot." That's when he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Let's talk soon. I've got some opportunities that might interest you." I smiled. Opportunities. The kind my father had always dreamed of. And now? They were being handed to me. I glanced toward the entrance for a split second, remembering the look on my father's face as he left. He had spent his entire life telling me I would never make it. That I wasn't good enough. That I would never amount to anything. And yet here I was. Not only proving him wrong, but thriving beyond his wildest imagination. I turned back to Richard and lifted my glass. "I'd love to talk," I said smoothly. "Let's make it happen." He grinned. "Now that's what I like to hear." As we clinked glasses, I realized something. I had been so focused on getting revenge that I hadn't taken a moment to appreciate something far more important. I wasn't just proving my father wrong. I was building a life so extraordinary that his opinions didn't matter anymore. And for the first time ever, I truly, genuinely didn't care what he thought. Because my future? It was mine, and it was limitless. The party carried on well into the night, but even as I spoke with my guests, laughed with old friends, and discussed business with people who actually respected me, I couldn't shake a feeling deep in my gut. This wasn't over. Not with my father. And I was right. Near midnight, just as the last few guests were heading out, my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket, and there it was. A message from my mother. "Your father isn't okay. He hasn't said a word since we left your house. I've never seen him like this. Call me." I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. This was what he did. Every time I stood up for myself, every time I refused to bow to his expectations, he played this game, turning himself into the victim. He wasn't, not okay, because of what I had done. He was like this because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. Still, something in me hesitated. A small, bitter part of me, the part that had once craved his approval, wondered if this was finally it. If maybe, just maybe, this was the moment where he would admit he had been wrong. So I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I called. The line rang once. Twice. Then, my mother's voice, tight and anxious. "Thank God. Your father needs to talk to you." A pause, then the muffled sound of the phone being passed. And then, finally, his voice. "You think you're better than me?" I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Of course. Of course, that's what he had to say. No apology. No regret. Just more of the same. I didn't even let him continue. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I wasn't doing this anymore. He wasn't my problem. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, walked over to the bar, and poured myself another drink. As I took a slow sip, I glanced around the grand home I had built for myself. This was my life now. And he had no place in it. I stood there for a long time, staring at my phone. The call had lasted all of 15 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. "You think you're better than me?" That was his response. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I was wrong." Not even congratulations. Just that same tired, bitter resentment. And in that moment, something inside me finally broke free. For years, I had been carrying his voice in my head. Every failure, every setback, every doubt, I could hear him sneering, telling me I wasn't good enough, that I was wasting my time, that I'd never be a real success. But tonight, standing in the middle of my mansion, with everything I had built, I realized something I should have known long ago. He was never my judge. I had spent my life trying to prove him wrong, trying to force him to see my worth. But the truth was, he never would. Not because I wasn't enough, but because he wasn't capable of seeing it. He needed me to fail. Because if I succeeded, if I thrived without him, it meant that all his cruelty, all his belittling, all his years of tearing me down, had been for nothing. And that was something his ego would never allow. I turned my phone over, placed it on the bar, and let out a slow breath. That was it. That was the last time I would ever let him have a place in my mind. A quiet knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see my best friend, Ryan, standing there, a knowing look on his face. "You okay?" he asked. I exhaled sharply, then smiled. A real, genuine smile. Yeah, I said. I think I finally am. He grinned and stepped inside, glancing around the room. You know, he said, grabbing a glass and pouring himself a drink. If I were you, I'd be feeling pretty damn good right now. I smirked. Oh, I do. Ryan raised his glass. Then here's to you, man. To proving every last one of them wrong. I clinked my glass against his, but as I took a sip, I realized something. I wasn't just celebrating proving them wrong. I was celebrating something far more important. I had finally let them go. And that was the real victory. The party had ended. The last guests had left. The house was quiet now, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace, and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. I stood in the grand living room, looking around at everything I had built. The success. The wealth. The life I had carved out for myself, without my father, without his approval, without his validation. And yet I felt lighter than ever before. Because this wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It never really was. I walked through the house slowly, taking it all in. The high ceilings, the polished marble floors, the carefully curated artwork. Everything here had a purpose. A story. A meaning. Because I had built it. Not to impress him. Not to earn his respect. But for me. For the boy he once called a failure. For the young man he never believed in. And most importantly, for the person I had become, stronger, wiser, and free. I picked up my phone one last time, staring at the unread message from my mother. I didn't need to read it. I already knew what it would say. Another excuse. Another plea. Another desperate attempt to make me feel guilty for choosing myself. I pressed down on the screen, hovered over the contact for a second. Then I blocked the number. And just like that, I was done. No more looking back. No more waiting for an apology that would never come. I poured myself one last drink, walked out onto the balcony, and looked over the city, my city. The place where I had built my empire. The place where I had created something greater than he could ever imagine. This was my legacy. And for the first time in my life, it belonged to me. Not him. Just me. And that was all I ever needed.